We've been talking recently about the beginning of the end of the Pax Romana. The last two episodes looked in particular at the Antonine Plague, the world's first pandemic, and it struck the Roman Empire around the year AD 165. We then talked about, in the last episode, a burgeoning crisis in the Roman food supply. What I really want to emphasize is that neither of these two factors, disease and food, were totalizing crisis. It's not as though there was famine sweeping the Roman Empire, or even that every Roman city was experiencing an epidemic burst of disease. There were hotspots. A crisis would flare up, and then there would be a period of respite. But the frequency with which some of these disturbances began to occur was at such a pace that it was just impossible for Roman political, social, and economic institutions to keep up. And over time, exhaustion began to set in. On today's episode, we will talk about another major source of stress that affected the Roman Empire at exactly the same time as these other challenges, and that is the Marcomannic War. I hope you enjoy this episode of the Pax Romana podcast. Episode 52, the Marcomannic War. When Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus took over the Roman Empire in AD 161, I just don't think they or anybody else expected that within a decade, a multifaceted crisis would be in full bloom in several regions of the Roman Empire. If anything, it should have been a new golden age. Lucius Verus had won a victory against Parthia, a foe that Rome had not beaten since the time of Trajan. And then prior to that Rome had not really beaten ever. All sorts of luxury goods and consumer goods coming across long distances were funneling into Rome. Laws and institutions seemed like they had never been stronger. The Parthian War matters for Roman perceptions of their own success because from a religious perspective, when the gods favored Rome, the Romans had military victories. Military victories were a kind of sign of divine approval. Military victories suggested that everything else was probably okay. That's the lens through which many Romans diagnosed the health of their own society. With dead barbarian bodies, an ever-expanding territorial empire, goods coming in from conquered peoples, and slaves walking the streets of Roman cities, having been subjugated by the Roman military machine. And so when Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus began planning their next war, they fully expected that it would work out just fine, and this was a war against several Germanic tribes in the north. The people that lived beyond the northern borders of the Roman Empire had always been a bit of a mystery to the Romans. They're still kind of a mystery to us because our main accounts of their culture come through Roman sources, who were, of course, hostile to Germanic tribes. Roman sources portray the Germanic peoples as disunified, barbaric, fragmented, nomadic, and just generally backwards. And yet at the same time, it's hard not to notice that the Romans never really conquered Germania. They tried a bunch of times, and they simply could not hold that territory. And funnily enough, in the end, it was peoples from that part of the world that ultimately overran the Western Roman Empire. The territories across the Rhine and the Danube were thick with forests. They were far from supply lines, apart from the rivers themselves. It was difficult for Romans to supply their own armies if they went too deep beyond those rivers. When Roman armies were isolated from supply lines within the Mediterranean, which was very, very rare, they essentially survived by stealing the fields and produce of the territories they were in. So it wasn't really foraging. But when Roman soldiers were off in dense forests or meadows, they needed those supply lines. Their whole society was based on agriculture, on the idea that a portion of the population worked the fields and soldiers were professional soldiers. They were not also field workers or hunters or foragers. But in the densely forested territories north of the Roman Empire, it was simply not possible to practice settled agriculture on anything close to that kind of scale. The soil was nowhere near as fertile. And so the people that inhabited those parts of the world were at least partly nomadic. Their housing was far more temporary. Their settlements, mobile. The artifacts of their culture, the technologies that they used were, as a result, far more simple. And so when the climate changes that I mentioned in the last episode began to affect what we might think of broadly as Germania or Magna Germania, that great region north of the Danube and east of the Rhine, those people had to go somewhere. They were already living life much closer to the margins, and the changing climate forced them south into Roman territory. By the mid-160s, thousands of them had poured across the river Danube, raiding the outposts of the Roman Empire and suggesting to Marcus and Lucius that they needed to respond. And as we saw in episode 50, the attempt to muster the soldiers in Aquileia was stopped even before it could really start by an epidemic outbreak of the disease responsible for the Antonine Plague. In essence, there were several years, we don't know how many, it could be as few as 2, it could be as many as 4 or 5, that the Romans simply could not defend that northern border. Invaders came down even into Italy, besieging the city of Aquileia, ransacking cities on the other side of the Alps, and raids across the Rhine at the same time afflicted those Roman settlements in the Gallic provinces. It wouldn't be until around 172 that Marcus Aurelius, and he was now alone ruling the Roman Empire, because as you remember from episode 50, Lucius Verus died of some mysterious cause, and Marcus was all by himself. Marcus, as you remember, by the way, was not the more military-minded of the two. But Marcus thought that he and his military commanders would be able to secure those borders and maybe even expand into German territory, that the best defense was a good offense, and it might even perhaps be possible to make a province of that area. Maybe 20 or 30,000 soldiers, therefore, were brought in to fight this war. It was not going to be just a few border skirmishes. The Romans were launching a hammer to smash these various Germanic tribes. And in addition to a military response, were diplomatic engagements as well. Because it's true, there were a bunch of different tribes involved. Many of them didn't like each other. And so the Roman government attempted to reach agreements with the tribes that they could to, at minimum, not invade Roman territory and in some cases ally against other Germanic peoples. Marcus had to pay out gold and silver to make this happen. And sometimes those alliances held, but at other times they did not. Because while the Romans understood the disunity of the Germanic peoples, they didn't always realize who was related to who had agreements with who. And so sometimes one tribe would sign an agreement with the Romans, but then the Romans would ask that tribe to fight against a people that tribe also had some kind of agreement with, or the king of the tribe that they had allied with was the second cousin of the king of the tribe that they wanted to attack. And in fact, those family bonds were stronger than the alliance with the Romans. And then often the allied tribe would have to make a decision, because if they don't honor the Roman alliance, the Romans would think of them as enemies. So they might preemptively attack the Romans. The war is called the Marcomannic War because the main, most consistent enemy throughout this time were the Marcomanni, one of these tribes. But in reality, this war was fought against numerous tribes. The Quadi, for example, were another large tribe that the Romans allied with at one point, and then later the Quadi broke their alliance with the Romans. On one of the battles, in fact, against the Quadi, we get a very famous story, which you can still see evidence of this on the column of Marcus Aurelius. If you ever go to Rome, that column is still standing. It tells the story from the Roman perspective of the Marcomannic War. You'll notice partway up that column, this creature that almost looks like a birdman. It looks like a big person with his arms stretched out, and it almost looks like he has wings or feathers or something. But it's not feathers that are dangling from his body. It's actually water and rain. In the summer of 172 AD, in the middle of Marcus's invasion against the Quadi, Marcus's soldiers had become exhausted. It was an especially hot summer. They were fighting against a people who knew that land very well. The Romans were foreigners in the land. They did not know where sources of water were. Their supply lines had grown thin. Marcus Aurelius himself was among these soldiers. And this army soon found itself surrounded by enemies in their territory and separated from resources. Numerous Roman authors record, however, a miracle that occurred to rescue Marcus and his army. That clouds suddenly cluttered the sky, and they burst thundering streams of water. The Romans turned their faces up and drank, catching water in their helmets. Their horses now also could be watered, and it forced the Quadi to actually have to fight the Romans. Evidently, they had hoped that the Romans would just succumb to the elements, and they wouldn't even need to fight. And so now, with the downpour, the Quadi charged the Romans. They got mired in the mud. Supposedly, lightning even struck them, and it led to a major victory for the Romans. We know that the story almost certainly happened. It is just mentioned in too many sources for it to not be true. Cassius Dio claimed that Egyptian magicians were responsible, but very quickly after the miracle, within a decade or so of it happening, Christians were also claiming that it was their God that provided it, that there were Christian soldiers in Marcus Aurelius's army who prayed and brought about the miracle. The earliest source for this is Apollinaris, who wrote a defense of the Christian faith in the late 2nd century. There are also imperial coins of Marcus Aurelius that celebrate the religion of the emperor, bearing the image of Mercury, suggesting that it was his piety that brought about the miracle. And unfortunately, we don't know the kind of play-by-play chronology of the Marcomannic War. We have the column, we have some accounts in historical writings like those of the Senator Cassius Dio, but otherwise we have to piece together the events of the war. We know that by the mid-170s, victory appeared to be imminent. The Roman strategy was build alliances where possible, subjugate where necessary. They also assassinated tribal leaders and sought to replace them with more pro-Roman leaders. In addition to money, by the way, the Romans also agreed to give Germanic peoples places in Roman military units, and this would include, of course, training in military tactics, in some cases weapons and supplies. By the mid-170s, Marcus had several thousand soldiers from Germania in his army. But unfortunately for Marcus, as his war was beginning to wrap up, things were beginning to look stable. Two events outside of the foreign policy arena forced him to divert his attention elsewhere and to leave the situation on the northern border unresolved. What happened? Well, the first was probably predictable. Marcus had been unwell as a young person. We are told by numerous sources that he was at times frail in body, and maybe it was the campaign, maybe it was the disease responsible for the Antonine Plague. We don't know what it was, but some kind of sickness struck Marcus Aurelius in 175 AD, and it was deadly. Sources record that soldiers thought Marcus was going to die. His own wife thought he was going to die. That's how bad his sickness was. The problem for Marcus is that he did not have an obvious heir. Commodus, his son, was still a teenager. He was not ready to take over. He had not named one of his generals a successor. For obvious reasons, he might risk being assassinated along with his son. And so it was unclear what was going to happen if Marcus should die. And this prompted the second challenge. Marcus's wife decided to take matters into her own hands. This is Faustina, the daughter of Antoninus Pius. She could think of only one man who had the military strength and record to succeed Marcus and bring this war to an end. And so we're told in several sources that she wrote a letter to Avidius Cassius, the man who had led the charge against the Persians in the name of Lucius Verus, the same man whose sack of the cities of Ctesiphon and Seleucia had supposedly spawned the Antonine Plague. Of course, we know that that's almost certainly not true. But why was Avidius Cassius and his soldiers blamed for the Antonine Plague? It's because of what happened in 175, 10 years later. Faustina wrote him a letter telling him that Marcus was on his deathbed and that it was up to Avidius Cassius to take the empire, and that she herself, were she to become a widow, would marry Avidius Cassius to help cement a change in leadership. When Avidius Cassius received this letter, he had to make a choice. It would not have been good for Marcus to be dead for a long time and nobody to have taken action. It took weeks for information to cross the Roman Empire. Marcus, for all he knew, was already dead. And there might be an open civil war very soon, if not perhaps one already burgeoning back in the western part of the Roman Empire. And so Avidius Cassius, who was a kind of super governor at this point in charge of numerous eastern provinces, including the breadbasket of Egypt, Avidius Cassius decided in AD 175 to declare himself emperor. And the eastern provinces decided to follow him in this course. But then, miraculously, Marcus Aurelius survived his illness. He did not die. And at this point, with an ongoing foreign war in the northern Roman Empire, and now what to Marcus must have seemed a great betrayal and rebellion within Roman territory, Marcus had a choice to make. Stay and continue to fight the Marcomannic War, or gather his troops, leave the border, and march east against the man who had delivered Persia to the Romans. It was not an easy choice. And we'll talk about what Marcus did on the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Pax Romana podcast. For more information, including a list of primary sources and further reading, check the show notes. Music by Red Productions and Exocore. Follow Professor Colin Elliott on X at ProfCPE or email colin@paxromanapodcast.com. Listen to more episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or just about anywhere podcasts are available. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.